Welcome to the Urban Agenda, a show that looks at the issues facing low-income New Yorkers. I'm David R. Jones, president of the Community Service Society of New York. Today we're going to focus on affordable housing. The good news is that New York City has the most extensive stock of affordable housing in the country, perhaps the world. The bad news is that we're not doing enough to preserve it. With us today to explore what needs to be done is Councilwoman C. Virginia Fields, who represents the Upper West Side of Manhattan and Harlem. Councilwoman, 2 years ago, my organization, the Community Service Society, did a study finding that literally hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing were at risk. How do we stand now 2 years later? Are we in better shape or worse?
That's an interesting question, but before I move to it, let me thank you, David, for continuing to focus on such important and timely issues that affect so many of us in our communities. I think we have certainly seen a number of improvements. I think it was during the administration of now former Mayor Koch, where a significant amount of money, millions of dollars, were put into the renovation of affordable housing, city stock, basically, to provide more affordable housing. We're seeing that come to an end, but during this time, I can certainly say within my own community, we have seen significant improvement as far as number of units available for people of low income, homeless families, and no income. We have seen an increase in the number of buildings that have that are now owned by residents of those buildings through the tenant interim lease program. So I can say that we are seeing improvement.
One of the reasons we wanted to invite you here today, other than you've been a longtime friend, is the fact that you've just introduced a bill in the City Council dealing with what's called early warning. Can you describe to the audience just what that's about?
Well, first of all, let me just say what triggered that particular bill. Regrettably, sometimes we wait until there is a catastrophe in government and we attempt to do something about it. But the good news is that we act and we don't just allow catastrophes to happen without trying to do something. This bill came about as a result, or following rather, the horrible incident on West 140th Street in Harlem. I think it was back in March of this year, where we know about 3 or 4 persons, I think, were killed, and everybody was displaced. And following that, I called for a hearing at the City Council in the Committee of Housing and Building, and a number of things were revealed. One, the communication between the Department of Housing Preservation Development and the Department of Building, there was a complete breakdown in terms of following through on what was known about this building. There were structural defects, there were outstanding arrears and taxes, and there was no effort in order to get repairs done on this building, quite frankly. So my office, working with a number of advocates, including representatives from the Community Service Society, pulled together a group and said, look, we need to do something. And one of the things we think we might be able to focus attention on situations like that early enough is through what we call early warning signals. So toward that end, we have introduced legislation calling for an early warning signals, which essentially establishes an early warning system targeting buildings that might be outstanding in taxes, liens, and numerous repairs. And it is intended for the Commissioner of the Department of Finance to identify buildings early, especially once they've passed, I think, 30 days or so, when the building would have been foreclosed if the city was still taking buildings that did not pay taxes and liens on, etc. The Commissioner of Housing Preservation and Development would be required to initiate an inspection. Depending on what is found there, the Department of Buildings would be required to complete a complete structural inspection of the building, and if there are defects, the owner would immediately have to make repairs or they could lose that building. The full intent of this bill is, first of all, to protect people. to protect lives so that we don't see situations as existed on 140th Street again. Secondly, it is to call to task landlords to take responsibility for those buildings. And thirdly, it will also inform tenants very early about the conditions of their building. And in some cases, it might even prompt tenants to want to come together and try to purchase the building because, after all, they live there and they have absolutely no place to go. So we think that it is a very important step moving in the right direction, and we will be having hearings on this building in the upcoming month.
I hope, and I'm sure in the course of your hearings, there was a recent report that you know about that was released by Alan Hevesy, the city controller, and State Senator Leichter, which found that the city had failed to re-inspect buildings throughout the city quite on the same level. Basically, the findings seemed to be that there was very little re-inspection of buildings to find these defects in Harlem, for instance, as opposed to the rest of the city. What is your feeling about how we're going to get the city to sort of join with us in focusing on low-income properties?
And without having done the kind of analytical study that the controller and State Senator Franz Leitner did, I concur with their findings. Actually, I probably could have let them know that even before. I think we have to really look at the whole process of inspection because, as you said, the way it works now, landlords do self-certification. And the city does not have sufficient number of inspectors to go and re-inspect to see if the work has been done or not. I think we have approximately 200 inspectors now, of approximately 125 are actually assigned to the field to do inspections. The report pointed out just in 1994 alone, there were over 240,000 complaints from residents about the need for inspection. So number one, we have an insufficient number of inspectors to do the work. I think we have to look at this whole process of inspectors being held accountable or responsible for doing their own inspections and certifying that the work has been done. The city, unfortunately, clearly does not have the resources right now to do any better. So unless we're prepared to put the money in there, increase the number of inspectors, or use some of our community consultant groups to be able to assist in this effort because of the fact that the monies are not there in the city's funds to do it. We're going to just simply we're simply playing games with people, playing games with people's lives, and we're not doing the job of code inspections.
I think it's understood, even as I talk to people in the city government and outside, and clearly the council, that everyone realizes there's not going to be a lot of money in the next couple of years to actually rebuild buildings or to put up new construction. That seems, with the federal government's changes and the problem the state and city are having. And I think everyone agrees that the only way to stabilize New York City for its poor residents is to make sure that existing housing that's still habitable stays that way. And I think we're going to join with you, obviously, and other members of the council in trying to insist that the best way is to increase the number of early warning systems, of code inspections that can keep habitable housing where it's at least stabilize it.
But the thing that concerns me, too, in all of this is that we continually run the risk of creating more uninhabitable housing when we do not do the inspections, and now that the city is not vesting any, more
I'd like
property,
to talk to you about that too.
That I think we run the risk of creating more abandonment. Then, once the housing has deteriorated so far, yes,
there's no money.
There is, and it's more costly. It's more costly to rehabilitate the housing, and it's just so clear that this is the scenario that we're creating here in the city now.
Let's talk about the city's new suggestion, basically. It hasn't quite turned into a full policy, that they will not take any more buildings for tax arrears or theoretically slow that process down. It sounds non-toxic, so we won't take any more buildings into city ownership. What difference does it make? What is your view about what the impacts would be if they stop taking buildings for failure to pay taxes?
Well, interesting. I can see it on both sides because it is extremely costly for the city, and facts and figures show that over the years of what it has cost to renovate and rehab this property. But on the other hand, because we do unfortunately have some unscrupulous landlords who will not do right by tenants and will not make the necessary repairs, we put the lives of tenants in danger. So I would rather see us err on the side of the city in terms of ensuring the safety for people, take those buildings and have a mechanism for putting them back into either the hands of nonprofits or private landlords. And I think enough systems exist and programs that we have seen would enable us to do that. We once had, and I'm sure you remember it because I think I was chair of community board then and you were deputy mayor, that we had the program of, I think it was called Sweat Equity.
Yes.
And that was a marvelous program for a number of people in low-income communities to gain access to property. They had resources within their families, their friends, and within the community to repair those houses. It might not have happened as fast. In some cases, it happened even faster than what the city was able to do. But they got it done, and they were able to get certificate of occupancies for them to move into it, and it helped to stabilize the community, but more importantly, it provided a home for those families and people who want to live in their communities.
There's another group that I'm worried about as we, clearly there's another impact of not taking these properties for tax arrearage. Basically, even though the city has essentially cast those properties into limbo, and when a roof starts to cave in or a boiler goes out, and the landlord, maybe a good landlord, wants to go and get financing to restore the roof or do the boiler, because the tax lien is still there, they can't get any equity loans to support their building.
I think that speaks to, again, another one of the ramifications that most likely will occur as a result of the city not vesting any more property. And I think that we have not began to see the tremendous impact that that policy is going to have, because I think we're now, within about a year and a half since the policy actually, or the practice actually started.
I hope they also start to develop nuance for landlords, decent landlords, who are trying very hard, who get into trouble because the carrying costs become too much, who they shouldn't be trying to kick out. I mean, if we could have a system which stopped vesting for those people and provided them some assistance. For instance, I'm worried, for instance, in the communities that I grew up in, Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights, where many of the elderly, as they who own small buildings with 3 or 4 apartments, often lose their way in many respects and can't keep up. And those often are the ones who start to lose their buildings for failure to pay taxes. Rather than taking those buildings, if they didn't want to vest, setting up programs to assist those kinds of owners, who are sort of the salt of the earth of our communities, to hold would be an interesting idea.
And I think going back again to the legislation which we have introduced, the early warning signal, this calls for selected vesting of buildings, and I think that it would most assuredly eliminate that group of buildings which you just referenced, but it will target those buildings where liens, significant number of liens exist on buildings, large amounts of monies in tax arrears. For example, going back again to the building on 140th Street in Harlem, it shows that taxes in excess of $96,000 were owed on that building. Most of our seniors have not allowed their taxes to build up to that extent. Level. So I think it's going to target certain types of buildings where the landlords are just totally uncaring, and in many instances have literally walked away from the buildings and they have not been targeted. The seniors still live in those buildings. They still make it their home. They're struggling. And if it's a way to identify some of those buildings and help them, maybe this would be a way to do it, because right now they're lost out there in the system.
Now, your bill does call that in the end product, if nothing else can be done, the city does take over the property.
Yes, selected vesting, as I said, that the city would be required to take it over, because it would have demonstrated that the landlord has no interest, no ability, or no intentions to do anything with it. And I don't think the city, being a part of city government, we would be responsible or acting responsibly to just walk away from it and do nothing, equipped with the information we would have at that point.
Now, you mentioned in your opening remarks that sometimes we wait too long. Isn't this really the first steps that the council has really taken to address this immediate problem?
To my knowledge, it is the first step that the council has attempted to address the really critical problem. And the council, like other legislative bodies and other institutions, sometimes we do wait too long and catastrophes happen. I was looking earlier this week at the catastrophe in Illinois, where the students were killed, and now people are saying, but we knew that was a system problem.
Right.
We knew this for some time. Nothing happened. Yep. And it is regrettable sometimes that catastrophes have to happen. But again, the good news, or rather the worst scenario, would be to do nothing knowing what we know.
Now, I hear your bill already has considerable support in the council, even before it's actually been voted on.
Yes, when we introduced it back in May, I think it was, of this year, a number of council members signed on and indicated support. So I think that speaks to why we're getting such an early hearing on the bill also.
And I get the impression that the support is not limited just to poor neighborhoods. I think you're getting some broad-based
support throughout the council, including Republicans, nonpartisan, everybody. I think when it comes to issues of safety, concerns for lives, trying to improve quality of lives where people live, you see it coming together across the line, whether those problems exist in another council member's district or not. And it helps to have important advocates as housing advocates, others behind the bill.
Well, let's talk about another constituency that's always critical. What has the city's reaction been to this proposal? Have you gotten any reaction back from Housing and Preservation Development or the mayor's office?
No, we've not gotten any negative reaction anyway, and in the coming weeks I hope to sit with Commissioner Wright, but Commissioner Wright was quoted in an article in the New York Times during the time that the building situation in Harlem was being discussed and the city's practice of not vesting other property, was quoted as saying one of the things we need is an early warning system.
Okay, so the term is getting out.
The term is getting out. Whether or not what the city is looking for is the same, I don't know. But certainly we want to discuss it and want to make the issue clear. It's about saving lives. It's about holding people accountable, private landlords and the city, and it is about giving residents and tenants an opportunity to own where they live if the situation should present itself.
Now, something else has just sort of appeared on the radar screen of the advocacy community. We don't know if it's going to be followed through, but there is some suggestion that the city may come forward with the notion of selling tax liens to private holders. In other words, selling them off. We are a little concerned because, again, I'm thinking of the people I grew up among in Bedford-Stuyvesant that are in Harlem, the little owners who get into trouble to see their buildings sold off that way. I'm wondering what your attitude would be. Obviously, we don't have full information yet about the potential risks of selling off tax liens.
Well, it's certainly something that I would want to look at much closer and understand what the proposal is actually calling for, because on one level we could be looking at displacement. We could be looking at certainly loss of properties that have been in families for a long period of time, and I would want to make sure we balance that with offering some assistance or opportunities for those individuals to do for their properties what they would like to do. So, you know, at this point, as you said, we know very little about the proposal, but I would certainly want to study it carefully and make sure that local people do not end up losing out and being forced out, or having private owners coming in and increasing the rents significantly, that it would result in the same thing, forcing people out.
I'm wondering, one of the things you said early on in this program that sort of caught my attention was the fact that now landlords certify that they've corrected deficiencies themselves.
Yes.
This is like my daughter, I shouldn't use that, she'll get angry at me. One of my children telling me that they brush their teeth and no one checks. Not a good analogy, but how can that work? Are you thinking in your bill of having something that does more than a landlord saying maybe we should redo it or look at it again?
Well, what this particular bill calls for, it would require HPD to certify that
not the landlord
not
anymore.
the landlord in this instance, because again, these are buildings that are perhaps have reached the lowest level of repairs not having been done.
Right.
They're numerous and they are extensive. So to ask the landlord to certify that structural defects have been repaired, to certify that the sort of life-threatening situations have been corrected would be totally insane.
Yeah.
So on this selected group of buildings, we would not follow the procedure that's in place now.
Now, there's a lot of discussion, obviously, about having not-for-profits take over some of these. We've been a little concerned seeing the hammering in the budgets that not-for-profits are taking. I'm wondering if we're going to set not-for-profits up for a fall. Can not-for-profit handle the load of taking over abandoned or nearly abandoned buildings or structurally damaged buildings? How are they going to get the assistance to actually do this?
Well, certainly we know of a number of cases where non-profits, I like to say, because not-for-profits get me all tongue twisted. The non-profits have been able to do a significantly important job in playing this role. But when it comes to the buildings that have been so neglected and abandoned, we've not seen them able to do it sufficiently without backup resources, and those resources, as you indicated, are drying up. So whether or not we want to put them in the position of taking these so severely deteriorated and damaged buildings and not be able to do any better, I'm not sure how that would work out.
One of the things that you talked about, the sweat equity, that I remember, obviously we have, you know, in my other work, the problem of our kids drifting around, particularly with all the problems in the education system and a lack of work opportunity. There's a pent-up wish, I think, by the elders of our communities and the kids themselves to do something constructive. I'm wondering if there's much sweat equity initiatives that are being fostered. Are people talking about that talk again? Very
few, to my knowledge, where that continues to happen, but it is a discussion that I think, in light of the dollars drying up that have been made available up to this point to create more affordable housing, it begs us to bring the question back on the table, because you're absolutely right. Not only does it provide decent, affordable housing, but it can teach some basic skills. And when we are seeing unemployment in our communities to the extent that it is, I think there is a ready-made group to be able to teach them some basic skills and trades.
I can't say anything more positively about the notion. When I was Youth Service Commissioner years ago, we funded a number of programs throughout the 5 boroughs, something called Youth Build and the rest. I've never seen a more exciting bunch of youngsters than those who have created, whether it's a shelter for battered women with their own hands, the sense of real pride that seems to come when youngsters get to help rebuild their community. I hope we find a way as we go ahead. I don't know where the money is coming from. And I've become just as much of a bureaucrat leading my not-for-profit as anyone else. But I hope we consider it if there is ever a turnaround, if we get this conservative wave pushed back, that we focus in on how we might engage youngsters in helping to rebuild their own communities.
And I think one of the things we're finding too, David, is we all talk about money. We know that's important. But with some of these initiatives, the amount of money is not as great. I don't have a figure to suggest here, but it is not as sizable as we would think for the returns that we're getting. Decent housing, eliminating abandonment, skills and trades being developed for people who are unemployed, skills that they can carry even beyond this city and work in other areas. So I think the benefits far outweigh
anything that Absolutely.
And we need to, you know, examine it, I think, more
Would you just tell our audience this bill is going to be presented? Can you give us some idea of how it's going to roll out and how our audience, if they're interested in the bill, can get information or perhaps testify or engage here?
I think at this point, as we speak, the date for the hearing has been set for November 9th. This will be a hearing before the Housing and Building Committee of the New York City Council, chaired by Councilmember Archie Spignam.
Right.
The public will be able to come in and speak and testify. Some advocates, housing groups, and most likely HPD will be asked to come in and speak on the bill as we normally would do.
Right.
And there will be a discussion. Whether or not there will be a vote taken that day, I don't know. There has been another bill introduced by the chairman of that committee that slightly parallels this, but we end up at a different position at the end. My bill calls for the city foreclosing on those properties where a landlord fails to do the necessary repairs. I think the chairman of the committee bill calls for HPD to do the emergency repairs or to evacuate the people from the building.
Thank you, Councilwoman Fields. Experts agree that the last wave of housing abandonments in the 1970s contributed greatly to the homelessness problem New York City faces today. Yet here we are in the 1990s looking at the same situation. This time we must not stand by idly. We can't close the door completely on affordable housing for needy New Yorkers. I'm David R. Jones for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.